I'd like to now invite Kavita. Kavita Panjabi teaches comparative literature in Jadavpur University, and she's going to take us to a slightly different plane as far as the production of literature is concerned. She's going to look at oral narratives, the oral accounts of women who she has been interviewing, which is of women who participated in the Tebhaga struggle in the 1940s. Kavita Punjabi. Comparative literature पढ़ाती है जिसमें मतलब सब चीजें सारी लिटरेचर का रहेंगी वहाँ पर.
एक सारी लिटरेचर दूसरे लिटरेचर की बात है. लोगों में लिटरेचर हिस्ट्री लोगों में लोकेटिंग लिटरेचर हिस्ट्री, but not how you can use literature to understand history and historical processes. That's what I'm going to be doing today. So that's my response to my historian chair today. I'd like to start by thanking all the people in ASR, associated with ASR, and especially Vigat, for not just for inviting me here today, but for having created an institute of this quality, because I think this is one of the most important institutes in South Asia that's reached out across all our countries to hold links between different people, purporting bonds and political linkages across the women academics, activists in South Asia. The women's movements in our countries have been doing a lot of this, but I think it's one of the most important institutes doing this, and I think it's an honor for me to be here today because of this. I'm going to be talking about women in the Tebhaga movement. I'll spend, what I'll do is spend a little while spend a short time talking about the movement itself and the participation of women, but my actual focus today is going to be on the problems of recovering and writing a gendered history of women or the women's movement in a context where there's a dearth of material gendered historical movements, events, where there's a lack of archival material, and where there's very few autobiographies, or hardly any as in this case. So how do we begin to retrieve and reconstruct women's histories in the context of this dearth and virtual absence, especially a gender perspective? There's a lot on Tebhaga, and I'll talk about a little bit more about the kind of virtues that do exist. So in the context of such dearth, of such a vacuum, one of the major resources we do have is oral narratives of women, and that then brings up another problem of how do we approach oral narratives? How do we make meaning of oral narratives, especially if you're going into the process of recovering this history after 50 years, which is what I started to do almost 50 years after the Tebhaga movement, that I realized, I think this was a whole process in itself. I read the book on the narratives of women in the Telangana movement. I'd heard about Tebhaga, I'd heard about the massive participation of women. So part of it came from knowing a little bit about Tebhaga, part of it was part of the history of our own women's movement. And what I'm going to be talking about then is how do we approach oral narratives, how do we make meaning of oral narratives. I'm not going to be looking today at cross-reading between oral narratives and archival material. I haven't got to that stage yet. This is still work in the process. But what I am going to look at is when women talk, or when people talk, I've been interviewing men and women in gender perspectives of Tebhaga, their narratives are representations. It's not what really happened. When we talk, we're always constructing, we're always representing. So when you're, and there is a process of selection, there's contradictions, there's silences. So how do you begin to read these narratives? And the other major problem that comes up is the layering of time and memory. Because your narratives change through time, your memory shapes narratives differently depending on the exigencies of the period, depending on the historical processes you lived through. My third is that when I, as an urban academic feminist, go to certain areas, whether I'm going to urban communist women of the 40s, who were major leaders in the 40s, or whether I'm going across to present women, there's certain epistemological and ideological differences that I'm working against or working across. So how do I build an awareness of these differences into my reading of the narratives? How can I turn a critical eye upon my own interpretations that might actually be distortive of historical narratives? And the final thing that I want to say is, of course, what runs right through the entire work itself. How does one begin to understand the relationship between the political and the personal in their lives. What were the kinds of negotiations that women made when they came out in such large numbers, and of the specific interrelations between the forces of class, religion, and gender that constitute both the specific identities of individuals and shape the politics of the movement. So what I'm laying out for myself is very difficult task, and I'm not going to be able to live up to all of this in the short time provided. I'm going to try my best, but I'm sure we'll continue talking about this later on also. I'll start with a brief account of women in the Tebhaga movement, and more specifically the women's movement within Tebhaga. It was the largest participation ever, as far as I know, of peasant women in political struggle in the history of the subcontinent, and it has never been acknowledged as a women's movement as such. So I'll start with that. What I said, the last thing I said was that Tebhaga, and I'm going to explain just now. Tebhaga, 1/3. I'm going to talk about it now. Tebhaga, te is 1/3. Bhag is part, and te is 1/3. Okay, and the last thing I said was that this was the largest, as far as I know, this was the largest participation ever of peasant women in political struggle in the history of the subcontinent, but it's never been acknowledged as a women's movement, which a lot of many of the activists I interviewed claimed it was, and I'll start with reasons why I think it wasn't, why I definitely take up that standard. It was a women's movement within Tebhaga. The Tebhaga movement itself, in the aftermath of the Bengal famine of 1943 and the inflation of the war years, exploited sharecroppers right across both what are now West Bengal and Bangladesh, launched an agitation across undivided Bengal in 1946-47, and in some parts it continued after independence too, to retain 2/3 instead of half the crop they cultivated on the land that was sublet by jotdars. Zamindars owned the land, was sublet by jotdars, and the practice was, there had been another movement in the past called the Adhyar movement, demanding half the crop. The peasants would keep half the crop and give only half the crop. Now it was a demand that they would keep 2/3 of the crop and give only 1/3 of the crop to the landlords and jotdars as rent expenses for the land that they cultivated, for the soil, for the fertilizers, etc., etc. The Tebhaga movement occupies an important place both in the history of land reform in India as a movement of impoverished peasants for greater control over land and crops, and in the history of local national liberation struggles from below. But it's also a very significant landmark in the history of women's movements in India, of a mutual enrichment of local grassroots women's mobilization and left activism in the struggles against imperialism and feudalism. And Tebhaga itself, the Tebhaga movement was launched by peasants with the active support of the Communist Party, or the Untitled Communist Party of India, and you had both men and later women too, going out and becoming members of the Kisan Sabhas and the Mahila Samitis, and acting as mediators and as catalysts for this movement. Tebhaga itself received short shrift in mainstream nationalist literature, so expectedly there's a complete silence of Tebhaga women in this historiography. It is in left histories that both Tebhaga and the widespread participation of women as activists and leaders has been well documented. But elaborate though they may be, these histories nevertheless use criteria modeled on former left male activism. And I emphasize former male activism in left histories too, because they subsume women's political issues and activities under the rubric of their contribution to Tebhaga as an anti-feudal and anti-imperialist struggle. They talk about the women's participation only in terms of what the women contributed, and that too, I would argue, is not gender sensitive. And there's been virtually no sustained, I say there have been small analyses here and there, but no sustained gender sensitive analyses of women's political activism or how it shaped our histories. And it's in this context that we set up, and I have to go back to this whole, to what Uma was talking about yesterday, the importance of collective enterprise. I started this work with two other women, both of whom have had to leave for various reasons, and I'd like to acknowledge my gratitude to Shimani Banerjee Chakravarti, who was in the School of Women's Studies at Jadavpur University, and who was a major moral and intellectual support right through this. Unfortunately, we can't continue with the work together. I'm continuing with it because she's had to go away. But we set out to tap the only sources now available to us, oral narratives of those women and men who were still alive in West Bengal and Bangladesh. We've covered 4 areas in Bangladesh: Norail, Nachor, Rangpur and Dinajpur, and 3 in West Bengal: Jalpaiguri, Medinipur and Kalki. Now, thousands of women participated in the movement is what the general mode of representation of women's participation is. Now, only a small percentage were urban women, and usually activists of the Mahila Atmaraksha Samiti, which had started up in 1942 as the Women's Self-Defense League for the purpose of self-defense against the GIs who flooded Kavita. But it was then renamed the Mahila Atmaraksha Samiti. Atmaraksha means self-defense, and the notion of self-defense gradually broadened out to self-defense against poverty, self-defense against deprivation, self-defense against hunger, as branches opened out in different parts of the country after the famine. So only a small percentage were urban women, usually activists of the Mahila Atmaraksha Samiti or the Communist Party itself, who moved on from famine relief work in 1943 to working with the Mahila Samitis in the villages. A vast majority of the women were peasants, but what's very significant is that most of them, the vast majority of them, were from lower caste or tribal communities. And such as the Rajboshis or the Namashudras, the lower caste, and the tribal communities such as the Shantals or the Orans in different parts. I'm not going into which communities in which part for the sake of time now. The oral narratives of the Tebhaga women establish that it was a period of crucial and widespread transformations in gendered social sensibility. For peasant women, the experience leading up to Tebhaga included sexual exploitation by rich farmers, witnessing the starvation of their families, and sometimes even being sold by their own husbands for food. But for all the women who participated in the movement, it was also a rupture with the past. It involved the formation of self-defense committees, networking across the rural-urban divide, and this was especially evident in the interactions in the work between the Mahila Atmaraksha Shamitis in the cities and the Shamitis set up in the villages, and in the forging of organized links and political solidarities between urban and rural women. And it also involved shifts in notions of chastity, and this is reflected very strongly in a lot of Manipur stories about how the demands of survival in situations of crisis, the need to survive, often open up gender relations in various ways, and this happened in the context of the structures of the family also, as I'm going to be talking about soon. And so it is a period of massive transformation, and this was, I'm now going to talk about why it is a women's movement that's taking place within Tebhaga. This was not a women's movement in the contemporary sense, for there was no deep-rooted critique of patriarchy, as had been articulated by the peasant women of the Telangana people's struggle, for example. Neither were there demands for women's rights to property, nor any conscious attempts to provide alternative gendered frameworks. Yet, the women's movement of Tebhaga was a historical landmark in terms of the articulation of gendered demands for rights relating to work, economic control of the household, and protest against sexual oppression. For the first time in the recorded history of Indian peasant women, especially for the first time in the recorded history of the Indian subcontinent, peasant women, and these are peasant women especially in Dinajpur, insisted on the right to be recognized as workers. And in fact, one very well-cited instance is when peasant women came up to women in Dinajpur and spoke to the Mahila Atmaraksha Samiti and said that, aren't we workers, don't we have the right to fight for our desh? And the notion of desh keeps changing, I'll talk about that. And they demanded, as active producers, greater control over the domestic economy. They also insisted in protested in various Tebhaga areas from Dinajpur to Norail against the sexual exploitation by the Jotdars. And here there's of course a caste divide also at work, because the Jotdars and Zamindars were normally from upper caste families, and most of the women, especially the peasant women, were from lower caste backgrounds. And there was a very, very well-established process of the sexual exploitation of women, including practices of sending the bride to the zamindar's home or the jotdar's home for the first night. It's only after the jotdar's taken been with her, the husband can. What's also very interesting is that once the question of sexual exploitation was raised within the party, women keep talking about how it was never put on the agenda of the party, but there was support from party members. And I suspect that this would part of the reason was this caste divide that also prompted the larger number of peasants to actually accept this as one of the to accept the whole question of sexual exploitation, because it was framed in anti-casteist context as well as anti-caste context, Jodhpur context. And what's very interesting though is how there were women also pressed charges of domestic battery against husband in political meetings. And there's a very oft-quoted incident of a woman standing up in the Kisan Sabha, pointing to her husband and saying, "What right does my comrade have to beat me up?" Had she said, "What right does my husband have to beat me up?" he would have been pushed back into the house. So what she was doing was obviously appropriating the egalitarian ideology of the Communist Party and bringing it into the forum of women's rights. And the issues were taken up, wife beating was banned, and a certain climate was created, even if only within Dinajpur, even if not in the other Tebhaga areas. I don't have evidence of this in most of the other Tebhaga areas, but in Dinajpur, this definitely did take place. And people do talk about the social and cultural ethos, especially in the context of domestic battery and violence against women in the household, having changed to some extent because of this. Now, these are facts that are gathered, and they're important, but there's some more interesting things one needs to look for in the narratives themselves. And they're not enough for us to develop an understanding of what kind of women's movement this was, what were the negotiations, what were the experiences of the women, what were the nature of the cultural and political negotiations, etc. What were the values that shaped the movement, what were the values that shaped the movement and sustained it, what were women's values that shaped the movement and sustained it. So, I'm going to talk about just 3 or 4 other points before I go into the actual analysis of a couple of songs and then a narrative. In the context of women's values shaping the movement, what one heard right across all the Tebhaga areas was that the movement became like one large family. We were knit together like that. But why? People would only talk about the jadoo of the times. And yet people would acknowledge right across that women sustained the movement, they opened up their households, they provided the basis for people traveling from one activist, male activists traveling from one village to the other. They talked about how women would treat them with so much concern, care, etc. But as I began to talk more and more to the women and look at more of this stuff, what I began to realize, and it may notice that Tebhaga wouldn't have been possible without the women's participation in Tebhaga. Because these were times, obviously, when there were no guest houses, rest houses, hotels, shops, dhabas, whatever. You had to depend on households for your sustenance and nurturance as you go from one area to the other. Now, what's happening in the context of family is that on the one hand, there is an unsettling of hierarchies within the family, because in this situation of crisis, women's activism was encouraged and solicited in terms of infrastructure, setting up spy systems, creating Mahila Bahinis for attacking the British and Jodhars, etc., British police and Jodhars. On the other hand, you also had men moving from one area to another. So women would often take over households. And in situations where there were large-scale arrests of men, women began to head not just households, but entire society. The village society began to be run by women. So you have an unsettling of the hierarchies within the family. You also have widows opening up their houses and participating in politics. And I'm not just saying that women opened up their houses and this is how they participated in politics. It was also women entering the battlefield. And what's happening there, on the other hand, what you have is tropes of solidarity, tropes of familial interaction becoming tropes of political solidarity. So people talk about Buri Ma, the widow, or so-and-so who was like my Bodhi or Bhabi, so-and-so was like my mother. And these interactions are what are responsible for everybody saying the movement was like one big family. And in just about a year ago, I've been doing these interviews for about 3-4 years, and when I went back to a lot of the women with the specific question, that what do you think, why would you call it a women's movement? What was your contribution? One of the things that a couple of the women said to me was in terms of the linkage between antarikata or andolon. Antarikata is more like apnapan but more andar se, and hum log apnapan le aaye the is andolan mein. So the relation, and I don't have an English word for it. It's not intimacy, it's not camaraderie. It's like jo dil se apnapan banta hai. It's that kind of, antarikata is difficult for me to translate, but it's the connection between antarikata and andolan. And they said that that is what was the most important thing for us, and that is what we think was very, very important for the movement too. And there's other interesting aspects of Tebhaga too, in terms of what were the political negotiations that women made to create a space for themselves for women's activity. And one of the people I talked to in the Bagyagani in Thakurgaon in Bangladesh said, he immediately asked me about this woman I knew in Kavita, and he said, well, we used to work together, and Rani used to come here. And so the women of the Mahila Samiti were really small those days. So why? Because Rani Rasgupta, who was the urban woman who had gone in there to work with the women in the Mahila Samitis there, had told them about the Queen ruling England. And they used to say, well, there, a queen can lead an entire, can rule an entire country, can rule an entire empire. And we Bengali women can't transform our areas, we're going to show you how to do it. So what's happening is that this is an anti-imperialist ideology, but appropriating the power of the woman and using it in the context of anti-imperialist politics. So given that, they then create a space for themselves within patriarchal politics, contesting imperial power. So I'm just pointing out a couple of things in terms of certain interesting aspects of the women's movement. And the last thing I want to bring up before I go to the actual analysis themselves is women right across. Be they urban women, be they peasant women, be they tribal women, be they lower caste women, all talked about the joy of stepping out. Maza tha, isliye nikle the. And brings us right back to the theme of bread and roses that has been an underlying aspect of this whole conference, and also warns us yet again against those dichotomies, against those traps of assumptions that are often imposed on us that first world women's struggles are for equality and empowerment, and third world women's struggles are against hunger and deprivation and for work. And the maza of coming out into the movement, and the Hurrah movement actually used the term maza, and others talked about the anundo, the shanti one gets from being in the movement. So stepping out was both in terms of fighting your state of oppression and deprivation, but also the joy of coming out together as women, which provided a lot of impetus to the women in the movement. And in the context of Antarikata and Andolan, I'd just like to mention one point. In political analyses, the structural notions of class have been heavily theorized in terms of politics that is based on your position in the class hierarchy and the struggles that you launch against oppression and deprivation on the basis of your position in the class hierarchy. But especially when you're looking at movements like Tebhaga, there are people coming in from a wide range of ethnicities, religions. You have Hindus and Muslims fighting with each other, side by side with each other. You have Namashudras, Shanthals, Rajbanshis, upper caste Hindus. What is it that binds these people together across the divides of ethnicity, caste, class? It's not just your position in the class hierarchy. It's not just the deprivation. There's got to be more that binds it together. Hence the importance of song in so many left movements. Now, what I would argue is that this whole notion of antarikata that these women are emphasizing so strongly, the building up of a large family across the entire area, this is what holds the people together also. Most of the men I talk to tend to write it off as the magic of the time. But how do we concretize this magic? What creates this magic? What creates these solidarities? So, this for me is a pointer within the women's movement as to ways in which we can further conceptualize the political notions of class, the ways in which solidarities are built across the differences in ethnicity and class and caste, etc. Okay, how much time do I have? About 10 minutes. What I'm going to be doing then is, I've been looking at the narratives and analyzing them for in different ways. One was analysis of songs which have not really been done in the movement, and I was going to spend some time on this, but I'll skip that. I'll just give you spend 2 minutes on it. I've taken songs which were sung to me in a village in a place called Kurigram in Rangpur in Bangladesh by this woman called Nirmala Roy, who said that they've been taught these songs by a major Tebhaga activist called the Shundari, who used to sing these songs during the Tebhaga days. And every year at Durga Puja, the women would stay up at night and then sing these songs all over again. But what was very interesting to me in these songs was that one was about in the voice of a woman of Rangpur who talks about her husband selling her for a handful of rice, and it ends with a remark saying that, and how her son starts. It ends with a remark talking about saying that if this is the state, যদি দেশের এই দশা থাকে তাহলে মা বোনেরা হবে অন্যের দাসী अगर देश की ये दशा रही तो माएं और बहनें बनेंगी दूसरों की दासी. Now, what's very interesting about this song is that it's obviously written in the famine years. It's sung during the Tebhaga years, and it's sung now by Nirmala Rai. Now, when I asked Nirmala Rai, what do you think this song is about? She says it's an anti-imperialist song. देश स्वाधीन करने के लिए गाना गाया गया था. But if we go back to the period, let's look at the way in which memory and time definitions change in time. When this song was sung during the famine years, there was no concept of nation as it exists today amongst the Tebhaga women. And the word desh also means in Bangla, which village you come from? The word desh, where is your desh? So it could have meant desh, it could have meant world in general, the vague abstract term. By the time it comes to the Tebhaga movement, we can't be sure about this, but gradually it would have begun to accumulate layers of an anti-imperialist meaning, because Tebhaga did take on an anti-imperialist character. Because when the activists came into confrontation with the Jodhas called it the British police, and then they take on the British establishment, etc., etc. So what you have then is a gradually accumulating notion of desh, and by the time Nirmala Rai sings it, to me, it's the modern Indian nation as it had been conceptualized in the context of the anti-imperialist struggle. Now, I have gone into play as well. The other song that she sang to me was not from the areas of Rangpur, but a song that was spread across various different villages by activists of the Mahila Atmarukha Shamiti in Kavita, and they would take this song from one place to the other. And this is a song about the Japanese invasion in Manipur. And the song evokes women in unity, to unite against such invasions. And but what's interesting is that this song talks about the violation of the Kulabodhu, or the upper caste respectable woman. Now, what's common to both these songs is the sexual exploitation of women. The reason why I'm bringing this whole example up is, one, to figure out the ways in which the sense of country, the sense of desh begins to build up, or how the term desh actually carries upon it an overloading of the sense of desh till it finally reaches the notion of country that as we have it today. But also to talk about the ways in which women actually make meaning, begin to understand the nation. What does nation mean to them? It's not the discourses that are handed down by politicians or by your Gramsci leaders. How does the nation begin to become, how does it begin to make meaning to them in concrete terms? And on the one hand, is this gradual accumulation of meaning of the term desh, but if you look at both these songs, one from an urban context, one from a rural context, in the first one, you do have a certain critique of the term desh, whatever it may mean at each point in time. On the other hand, you have a song evoking women. The urban song evokes women to unite against the enemy. And there it is uncritical of nation. So for peasant women, the meaning of nation becomes multi-layered, critical at some points, uncritical at others. But it's definitely not as uncritical as mainstream nationalist politics would make it out to be. So what you have is women developing a particular perspective on nation, in this case in the context of sexual exploitation, and talking about, one, challenging the desh or the state of the desh or the village or country, and two, talking about uniting against exploitation. So what's very interesting to me is how these meanings generated, how they accumulated. How does politics begin to make meaning, begin to become meaningful for these women? Okay. I'll now go on to my last example, which will take 5 to 10 minutes. This is basically what does one do with one question I have is what does one do with contradictions in a narrative? But the more important questions that come up in this case is how does one look at the intersections of class identity, religious identity, and gender identity, class, caste, religious, and gender identity in a particular woman, and in this case, or in the movement itself eventually. But in this case, I'm going to be talking about Ila Mitro, who was a leader in Nacho, in the area of Nacho, which is now in Bangladesh, and she was imprisoned. She underwent severe sexual torture. She refused to earn her freedom through compromise because she was offered freedom often, many a time saying, "Man, if you don't engage in politics again, we'll release you." She stuck to her commitment. After release, she came back to India because she was in she needed treatment and she was in severe state of breakdown. She also became a major national heroine in Bangladesh, and also one of the major figures of the Bhasha Andolan. Now, what I want to, and what the reason I'm bringing this up also now is that it's not easy to get at the ways in which class and caste and religious identities intersect with gender identities. And sometimes I think we have to be ready to take up stands, live with stands that may be politically incorrect. Live with them for a while in order to be able to push beyond them to get at greater complexities. And the reason I'm saying politically incorrect is it would seem very politically incorrect for me to be so severely critical of a national heroine and of a left heroine, as I'm going to be. But staying with it for a while in great discomfort actually enabled me to find ways of pushing through this to get at the ways in which her class and caste identity actually did intersect with her gender identity, and helped me find a way of developing some understanding of the interfacing between rural and urban women, and of the difficulties of this interaction between rural and urban women. Ila Mitra was an urban middle class and upper caste leader of Shauthar tribals in Nachol. And when we went to interview her, we witnessed a radical dissociation between past and present that suggested a complex layering of memory. She had been subject to acute sexual torture in prison after her arrest, and had refused to give ground despite such torture, and had changed residence to India later on rather than compromise on political grounds. She was released finally on the grounds that she went to India. We met her and this was post-partition. She was released post-partition. We met her in a modest flat in Calcutta shortly after she returned from the 50th anniversary celebrations of Tebhaga in Bangladesh, where she received an overwhelming reception from lakhs and lakhs of people, including a large number of tribals, as a national heroine. Now, there were two or three critical markers of this rupture between past and present that we discovered initially in her narrative. The first was the contrast between the passion with which she spoke of the past and of her political life, and the more distanced, relatively dispassionate tone she adopted in the narration of her current political activity. She's been very active with the National Federation of Indian Women, and she was an MLA, a member of the State Legislative Assembly from the Communist Party, CPI. Now, this difference in tone and emotion became a very crucial textualizer for us. She narrated with intensity and involvement her experience of the plight of the poor during the famine, which was the motivation for entry into left politics, her activism during Tebhaga, and the courage of the tribals and Muslims who had chosen torture, even death, over betraying her to the police. On the other hand, she spoke of her current involvement in the NFIW and electoral politics in a very matter-of-fact and almost distanced, yet subtly self-aggrandizing tone. And to this, I will also add that this discomfort with the subtle self-aggrandizement that one saw in her became even more evident when, say for example, she left a message when she called her, or it wasn't told, she left a message once saying, well, say the MLA called. And I came back and I couldn't figure out for the life of me who the MLA was. Till 2 days later, somebody said, did Ilani call you? She told me she called you, and then I figured out. So what you have is, on the one hand, okay. Now, what becomes important here, the most interesting thing that happened was that when we went to see her the second or third time around, she said she'd actually given testimony in court about the political torture, about the sexual torture she'd experienced. And there was a biography of hers that Malika Begum from Dhaka has written, was there with her. And she said, well, the testimony is here. And we expected her to give it to us. She didn't give it to us. The other expectation was that she would tell us what she had testified to in court. She didn't do that either. What she did was she started reading this testimony of sexual torture out to us. And this left me incredibly uncomfortable, because one could understand her reasons for not wanting to narrate it, because it's recalling afresh the pain and torture of that situation. But on the other hand, you can easily hand the book over and say, well, go read it. So there was a need to read it out and say, look, I said this. Now, these were things that I was very, very uncomfortable with, and I felt extremely disturbed that I had to take up such a critical stance against a woman who had shown such courage and such grit and such determination, and would have the courage, would have the stamina to enter politics, re-enter politics again after she'd recovered. So, when I went to meet Malika Begum again in Dhaka, the first question that Malika Begum asked me was, did she say that the testimony was hers? And I said, yes, of course, she only talked to us as her testimony. And Malika up at that point said that, when I first went to her with the material, she was a reluctant subject for the biography, but she gradually began to talk, and when I showed her this testimony, which I got from Bangladesh, she looked at it and said, had I said this? So the initial reaction was, look, such traumatic experiences do cause psychological ruptures, suppression of certain kinds of memories, and maybe these dissociations, these ruptures are because of that psychological trauma. But to go back to what I was saying in terms of the slightly self-aggrandizing tone, the message about the MLA, and the way she talked about the Shantals, because her husband was the Zamindar son who declassed himself and led the movement. When she went into that, I had to really struggle for a whole year, and she talked about the Shantals as being dirty, as being half naked, and how I had to really adjust myself to living to them, living according to being accepted by them. All these markers of certain hierarchies and of certain self-aggrandizement suddenly fell into place when we started talking to her husband and to other people regarding her husband's position. And when we realized that she'd been the Zamindar's wife and she was called Ranima, the term was not an honorific in terms of respect for her work, but because she was Raja Babu's wife. Raja Babu was the Zamindar. So then one begins to see a certain kind of continuity between the past and the present, that while her political commitment and activism were more than exemplary, yet her subjectivity was nevertheless marked by her class and caste identities. And this is a problematic question that we do have to address in the context of mediation. When urban Communist Party workers went into the villages to work with people, what was the interaction between them? What were the barriers that came up between them? And what is very evident here is that Iladi's caste and class identities inform her subjectivity as much as her gender politics do. The other glaring contradiction here was between the national acclaim and that she received in Bangladesh and the critical perspectives of the few remaining Santhal women we interviewed in Kushmadana, a village in the area where she worked. One of the women voiced a fear of Ila Mitra and the Lal Jhanda, and another one recounting the rivalry between the Muslims and the Santhals that followed the killing of a Muslim Daroga in the empire of the British explains why. He says, they started the Raj and we were caught, everyone, all Santhal men. Those who could go away did, and all those who remained were caught. Ila Mitra also fled. After she went, they, meaning the Muslims, burnt everything, our houses, our belongings. The landowners took away our paddy, etc. Now, Khuda Baksh, a Muslim comrade of Ila Mitra's in the area, whom we also interviewed, voiced his political criticism of her leadership, saying these riots between Muslims, who were a relative minority in the area, and the Shantals could have been avoided had she kept up more communication with the Muslim Tebhaga activists. So, The point here is to say that in reading, in light of the class, caste and community politics of the area, this reading of a narrative also facilitated the historical realization that her rise to national fame after her albeit admirable courage in the face of political sexual torture was undeniably linked to a position of privilege in society. Now, the last thing, I'm going to take just 5 minutes on this, and I have to say this is the most important part. I might lose out in 5 minutes, but I think this is really important. Now, the thing is that what I'm trying to end with is our own political and ideological and epistemological biases in interpreting these narratives. And I was very uncomfortable with this critical interpretation of Ila Mitro, extremely critical one, and that made me question myself again. And upon questioning my own interpretation, I had to acknowledge my epistemological limitation. I had only her narrative and her husband's, and of some remaining Chantals whom we managed to interview in Nachor. So these are very limited sources for knowledge of her life and motivations. My differences vis-a-vis the way in which she understood her life and the ways in which I derived knowledge of it also had to be accounted for. Her framing of her narrative had to be understood in the context of her life as an activist and in terms of her commitment. And in creating this critical narrative, I was moving away from the continuity that her continued commitment, from her political investments that her continued commitment showed. So I became aware of my own political and ideological biases also in the context of my criticism of her investment in electoral politics and her need to assert herself in the context of electoral politics. And that may be something that I began to realize that there was certain romanticization of left activism or in the past of that simple life of giving up all you had. And I was becoming overly critical of her need to assert herself as a woman. And it may not be the way in which I will do it, but there is a certain assertion of herself as a woman and memory. So as the traces of commitment accumulated, ranging from her response to the injustices of the famine, to her accepting the hardships of life among the tribals, from her courage in upholding her progressive ideology in the face of severe torture, to her courage as a woman from an orthodox Hindu background, testifying in public to the sexual torture to which she'd been subject. And there were other women who had said, look, you're a member of the Communist Party, you have to live up to the needs of the movement, you have to testify. Two other women in jail sent her a note saying that you have to talk about what's happened to women within the party, what's happened to us as activists, otherwise the world's not going to know what's been happening to women. These were things that gave her the courage to overcome the demands of her traditional Hindu identity and develop a more radical identity. Now, all these, and from a genuine commitment to the memory of tribals and Muslims who suffered or died to protect her, and the inordinate resources of strength and genuine political beliefs that must have been necessary to re-enter the field of politics after a psychological breakdown. These were things that then one needed to look at and develop a third narrative that emphasizes the power of her commitment to left politics, to women's experience of exploitation, and to a sense of bonding with the tribal and Muslim minorities, because that is what has kept her going after all these years. It also helped us estimate the power of the progressive politics of the period that could have inculcated such resilience as hers in continuing with committed political activity in the aftermath of severe political and sexual torture, especially as a woman from a relatively sheltered and orthodox middle-class, upper-caste urban background. So the point here is not obviously about which interpretation is the true narrative. The truth is a complex combination, whatever the truth may be, is a complex combination of these narratives. The point is that an awareness of our own personal, political, and epistemological biases is crucial for a more complex and multi-layered understanding of historical processes. Thanks a lot.
Now, I think we are, in order to keep time so that we have enough time for the next presentation, I would urge that those of you who are going to ask questions of detail and clarification, do that outside at tea time. Those who are raising issues which are central to the paper and to issues that we need to address from the point of view of the Women's Studies Conference generally, please, those are the questions that we should have give priority to. Yeah, I can see one hand right away.
Very nice presentation. I just had one question that we've sort of brought up in the past couple of days. This was a very powerful movement of peasants and the upper class women. We've sort of always been saying that between the class and the caste divide, it's difficult to get women together. How do we see this kind of an example, taking this as an example, getting women together and moving on from here for whatever rights they are advocating.
Okay, Kavita, it was indeed a pleasure listening to you. But I was just wondering, like your equation of Desh with nation, because in my own studies, especially talking to the Adivashi women and Shautals, I found that, like when they talk of Desh, you were right that they mean their district or their living abode. But when I raised the question of nation, they were saying it's Jat or Jati. And so I was just wondering that, because Jat not in the real caste sense, but they, like I said, what differentiated you from Bengali, they said, Amadir Jate Lok Na. Not the people from my clan or tribe. So it had more a clannish or familial connotation. So I was wondering if you could, just make this distinction, because Desh after all is district or a physical location, and nation has more to do with one's psychology and more to that. Thanks.
Thank you, Kavita, for actually a very fascinating paper. Well, fascinating because, you know that my own graduate work is all on the Tebhaga movement. And so I'm not going to go into too many of the technicalities, because really then becomes that inner language of that movement. In fact, one of the areas missing in my own work was trying to get information on whether the enormous activism and involvement of women in the Tebhaga movement were raising any questions and issues vis-a-vis women, or in any way can we classify that as a women's movement within a movement. And I'm delighted when you had the opportunity to do some oral narratives. I unfortunately only had the archives, and you know that there's insufficient evidence there.
And I have women's movement.
Sorry?
And I have the history of the women's movement behind me.
You had the history of the women's movement, and as I was telling you, I did my work 30 years ago or something. Two areas that are of concern, and I'm not suggesting that we have an answer to that. One is that I appreciate totally when you're talking about the intensity of that movement and the coming together. It's actually a wonderful history, and I wish Pakistanis would get involved, because that movement influenced the communist, the manifesto of the Muslim League, and also what happened in East Pakistan subsequently in the quick land reform there, etc. So it's of particular interest, I think, to Pakistanis. But in this movement, that heightened intensity, I find we find in a lot of struggles at that time. I'm not very sure, and would like, not for you at this moment, for us to all get more information on whether the involvement of women gave this sense of what we might call family, or what you were saying, I forget the word you used, but that sense of the involvement of the self as opposed to the underling. So I'm wondering whether that is not inherent in a lot of movements at that moment of intensity. The other part of it is that, in fact, after the 47, when a lot of these areas you're talking about became or were part of East Pakistan, and there were sort of responses to it by the state in terms of the early land reform. There's a lot of reasons why that land reform happened much earlier, but none of these women's issues got addressed, not even in giving the land to women as well. So it's sort of when in national liberation struggles or in struggles of the left, women do in fact even raise some of these issues. At the moment that battle is won, or that independence won, women are then again meant to go back into their, what have been their traditional roles. And that happened also in East Pakistan after 47. So, just when you continue talking to these women, and I hope you will, we will try and see how they felt and what happened post-47 to their particular demands, because also this happened in Nicaragua and Vietnam, where women's issues were raised within the movement, but then again, after the revolution, they got to this completely subsumed.
I have partial answers.
Okay.
Kavita, we generally tend to think in terms of the divisions within the women's movement, on the basis of class. And so I was interested to find out, because at the same time with these self-defense societies, there would also be urban committees, which were also a large number of them, a large number of communists within those. And do you find a commonality, common interests, communication between the two? And would this have been possible because of the communists themselves, or was this something that happened between women?
Okay, we really appreciate the openness and frankness with which you confess that when you go ahead with research, there is the chances of personal bias creeping into the research, as well as we have our own shortcomings in terms of what we are looking at or the way we are looking at from a feminist perspective. And just now, as Bunny has shared her experience of the same research, and as you have done. So I was interested in knowing, do you intend to come up with a comparative analysis and putting together the research undertaken by other feminists on the same issue, or you intend to plan or come up? Because even if I work at a thing for I think after 2 years, I also have a feeling that it needs a revision, or my own way of thinking in the due course, or maturity of thought comes in the due course of process. So what do you intend to do to overcome that, or is there a plan that you come up with the sharing? Because if you're talking of feminist literature or approach towards things, as just Neelam started, most of the people from the floor remarked that you would have thrown it away just about talking about popular literature. That is a rigid way of looking at things. And when you go ahead as a researcher, to what extent are you mentally prepared to go ahead with it?
Is there any other question at the moment? Do we have a question at the moment? Okay, and Kavita.
Let me start from the last question upwards. No, I'm not going to be going into comparative analysis research on the feminist work, because I'm having a tough time dealing with this work right now. Let me finish this. Also, I think that would need to be a collaborative effort. Back to the word collaborative. It would need to be a collective effort where different feminists could come together and talk about their own research and analyze their own perspectives and how they shape their work. And I think that would be a very, very rich project that would be very instructive for us in the women's studies movement also. I don't think it's a task for one person to conduct on their own. Basically what you said, Kavita, in terms of the divisions of class within women's movements, I think it was both. Because yes, there were a lot of commonalities. Especially, and women have talked about this, urban women have talked about this, to some extent rural women also have. The difference is rural women tend to give you events and incidents, narrative events and incidents. I went to each one of them saying, tell me the story of their life, because I wanted to contextualize their participation in the movement within their lives. But from the rural women, I inevitably got incidents, especially during Tebhaga, once they learned I was talking about Tebhaga. The urban educated women gave me narratives. Now, the thing is that, so hence it's in the urban women's narratives that this comes out a little more than in the rural women's narratives, but it does there too, that the commonalities were something that were used very consciously to forge these links. And in fact, had I had more time, I would have gone into more detail into the analysis of the songs. But for example, the fact of sexual exploitation that women face in their lives across classes, the questions of control over the household, the pressures of looking after the household, as well as being active in politics, being political activists. These were definitely things that did help forge the links. But on the other hand, I think it was also possible because of the Communist Party, and specifically in this period because they all talk about the nurturing role that the Communist Party played, and how many members of the Communist Party encouraged women to come out, helped train them, helped create certain awareness. And in certain areas, the Mohila Kashmiri did not have branches. The urban Mohila Kashmiri did not have branches. It was the CP that encouraged the setting up of the local shamitis. So both in terms of creating a certain awareness, encouraging a certain political awareness, which women then negotiate from within their own lives as to what would nation mean to them, what would the Tebhaga struggle mean to them. They had their own perspectives, but there was a lot of nurturing going on. And there are certain places where women even talk about the party as the mother, as the nurturing mother, which is very interesting for me, especially when you talk about the nation as mother. And I won't go into that now. But I think, and if we take it out of that immediate period and come into a larger period, into more contemporary periods, I think historically worldwide we've seen that the maximum number of women's movements have developed within left movements and then moved out of them to develop their own, to be able to continue with an autonomous women's movement politics. And I think this kind of support that the women got from within Tebhaga, support from the Communist Party, could only enrich us, and that's why we're all, looking for linkages with other movements. Nikit, your questions were very critical questions, and I have to admit I was very conniving and shrewd about leaving out that part of the talk because I knew the question would come up and I'd get a chance to address it since I was playing for time. Yes. See, the thing is that I agree with you that the involvement of women is, it's not, involvement of women in this fashion is not special, especially in peasant struggle, is not special to the Tebhaga women. But what I would like to emphasize is that given the nature of the scale of the participation of women, given the nature of their active interaction with each other, there were Mahila Samitis where they worked together. Also, there were times when, as I mentioned earlier, when women took on the leadership of entire societies. So, given that, the nature of this involvement in peasant struggle took on a far more significant dimension than it may have in other peasant struggles. And regarding the question of land issues for women, that's a major sore point with us in West Bengal today. In fact, is Ratnamurthy here? I can't remember Jayati's last name because I always confuse it with that. Jyoti Gupta. Jyoti Gupta has done very interesting work on this, also very important work, I feel. She's gone and talked to women's organizations and women's wings of the CPM, of the ruling CPM now. And one of the criticisms that we have of women's wings of the left movement is that they do not move towards issues of autonomy for women, which are rooted in ownership of land. They deal more with issues of work and production and women's participation in the production process, but the crux of the matter lies in women's ownership of land. Now, on the one hand, Tebhaga did have a certain influence in the land reform process, and West Bengal has one of the most progressive histories of land reform in India. But on the other hand, till recently, I think it was sometime in the 70s, I forget the date, very bad with dates, sometime in the late 70s or early 80s, there was an amendment that the land be issued in the name of both the man and the woman, joint pattas be issued, but that has not really been implemented across West Bengal. And there are a lot of women at the grassroots level now wanting this, but it has not been taken up as an agenda officially as yet by the women's wing of the political parties. So, especially at the CPM. And to come back to Amina's question about Desh. Amina, yes, thanks for pointing that out because I had skipped over that in my rush. Desh, for me, would go through various levels of meaning. One is Desh of your immediate village. Another would be Desh as Jati, and that became one of the most important sites of debate in the context of nationalism. Also, when we're talking about Desh, we're referring to Jati, we're talking about nation. And here, I don't have any proof from my narratives of the conceptualization of Desh as Jati. Maybe if I go back to them again, I'm constantly going back to them, I might find some more evidence of this. But what I would suspect is that they definitely meant the Desh in the sense of Jati also, because the women we're talking to, the peasant women, are lower caste women. In this case, where the songs were sung definitely, and there is a definite caste difference between the Namashudras or the Rajvanshis and the Jotdars and Zamindars who belong to upper castes. So there is that sense of our Jati as opposed to the Jati of the Zamindar. So when you're talking about the Deshe Ei Dasha, the Deshe Ei Dasha Rahito, then you're talking about the Dasha of your own Jati and another Jati imposing upon it or repressing it. The first question last, how do we link this with the present? Where do we take this history? What could its significance be to the present? I think one would be on the most general level in terms of our understanding of ourselves and our women's movements. We've too often been accused of importing feminism from the West, and we've had our own indigenous histories of grassroots women's movements. Another is of an understanding of women in peasant struggle, which we don't have. Here I would reiterate what Nighat was saying about let's not look at knowledge only functionally. Let's stay with it and develop our understandings, deepen our understandings. And also the ways in which this has fed into the demand for land reform, and even though the memories of Tebhaga are not strong amongst this generation of women, we have it. We have access to this history, and then activists who are going out, even women like Jyoti, who are going out into the villages now to mobilize amongst CPM women, bring back this history and then use it in terms of the demand for women's land reforms for women. And finally, it's as a historical precedent, and here I'm being very utopic, it can also serve as historic, it can serve not only as historical precedent but also as future imperative for radical transformations in gender relations, in the collective efforts of left political activism and in the transformations that collective efforts between left political activism and women's movements can facilitate. Thanks.